How's it going, everybody? Ridiculously Awesome Machines here. We're going to be continuing off of our last video, continuing our playlist of explaining computers simple. On today's episode, as you can see, we're going to be continuing straight from where we left off. We're going to be moving into cases. So, let's go ahead and just move into this. So, cases, or form factor cases. You're going to see three types of cases. Sometimes you can see some weird ones, sometimes you can see normal ones. Generally, for your form factor cases, you're going to see small, mid, and full. What does that mean? Well, those terms for small, mid, and full, obviously, small being a small case, easy. Mid-size case is usually, that's what it refers to as a mid-size. It's your middle. It's what falls in between your small and your full size. And then a full size is generally what you would call a large case. So generally most computers they consist of a mid-size case, a full-size case, very big case. I don't have measurements exactly on me right now, but generally full-size cases are quite large in comparison to the other two. And we'll get into. So this next part, actually, we'll just go into it now. We're going to cover the pros and cons for each case. And I'll kind of elaborate on what I'm meaning for pros and cons. So when selecting your case, obviously, you want to choose the one that's best going to fit you. So if you're planning on, personally, I would say if you're planning on using a office computer just for office work, I would recommend a small size case because most likely you're not going to need the room for a GPU and a lot of that stuff. So we'll go for pros and cons. So pros and cons for a small size case. More room. Obviously, it's a smaller case. Generally, depends on what brand of case you go with. You're generally going to have quite a bit of room to work with. It's going to be smaller than your average computer. And so that'll give you more room. Also, due to the fact that it's a small case, there's not going to be as much stuff going into it, and the cases are smaller in size, so they're obviously going to be lighter. The third pro for a small size case is cost. Cost is a big thing when you're running on a budget. If you're doing a budget build, depending on what you're trying to build, because if you're trying to build a desktop computer for just doing office work, a small size case will not only be friendly for cost, but also for space. And the last pro that I have for a small size case is it fits a small motherboard. Now obviously you can see on the cons that's also a thing, and I'll explain why it's both a pro and a con. For it being a pro, it means that it's a small motherboard, so obviously it fits into your small size case, and small motherboards mean less hassle with extra components, and all in all, it's smaller. We'll move over to the cons real quick. So cons for a small case are going to be it's going to have less space. What is that? Why do I say that? Obviously, you have more room to be able to. It gives you more room for your desktop wherever you decide to put it, but also computer-wise, you have less space. So for a small size case, this means you have less fan space, you have less potential for storage space, and obviously you're using a small motherboard. And so the reason why I also included small motherboard in the cons is because for small motherboards, what happens is a lot of small form factor motherboards such as ITX or Micro, they both generally, unless you specifically buy one that has multiple RAM slots, you're not gonna have potential to have 4 RAM. You're only gonna have potential to have 2 slots. And the reason why you want more RAM is so then you can have the ability to, like I said in the last video, be able to run multiple applications at the same time. I also wanted to correct myself. RAM, basically how it functions in the computer is it allows applications to run, and it allows them to run on the side, so whenever you're needing to use them, your RAM can hold on to the running process, and then when the CPU, whenever you decide to use that program, your CPU has quick access to it. But I digress. Small form factor PCs, generally, they have less space, so it means less potential for fans, and it also means that you're going to have a smaller motherboard, meaning that you're going to have less components you can put into that motherboard. And like I said, it has less cooling potential. Now, all in all, doesn't mean that a small case is bad. It just means that you have to think what you're going to be using your computer for when it comes to building and choosing a case. I personally, I do gaming, and I also do office work. So with gaming, I generally want a CPU. Some small form factor cases, such as the one I have on the screen here, they can fit a full-size graphics card, or sometimes they'll fit smaller graphics cards, because all the graphics card is a chip on a motherboard, and then how they are designed depends on the company that you're buying the graphics card from. You can get smaller graphics cards that will fit in small cases. Do I recommend it? No, because I would say you always want the most potential for cooling that you can get, which in a small case you're not going to be able to get for your GPU. And also in this case, you can see that this computer, this small case, still has enough room. It's lengthwise, it has enough room to still fit a 3-fan AIO. But not all cases are going to be like that, especially if you're not getting one that's built for that. All these cases here are all Corsair, but there's a lot of companies for cases. They all make cases. There's a bunch of companies that make cases, and so there's plenty of potential to buy different cases. I personally go with Corsair because Corsair is a big brand for components for computers. They make cases, power supplies, RAM, storage. They make and they also make fans. They do a lot of the stuff for the extra, but then when you get to motherboards and CPUs and GPUs, those are different. They're going to be different brands. But Corsair, generally, I go with them for a lot of my components, for my fans, for my AIO, for my case, and I believe my power supply is also a Corsair. So I would highly recommend Corsair when coming to your cases, and obviously this one that I have up here is one of their good cases that is a small form factor case, but instead of having the length and the height, it has length and width. So you could still do a small form factor build, but it also allows you to still have that back part where most likely your storage is at. Like I said, it's all about what you plan on building, because if you go and decide to go with a different company for your case, there's a chance that you're not going to have that width, and it's just going to be a small computer, and you won't have the space to put what you need to run components. What I use is a mid-size computer, form factor case. So what are the pros and cons of a mid-size computer? Pros for a mid-size. Obviously, you have more space. For that space, meaning that you have more potential for fans, you have the potential to use a larger motherboard. With a larger motherboard, not only does it give you more PCIe slots, and when I get to the motherboard video, I'll explain what PCIe is, but it gives you more potential for PCIe slots, it gives you more potential for SSD slots, it gives you more RAM slots, and all in all, it just gives you more potential inside the case for cooling and all your other attachments for your motherboard for whatever you want to use it for. Obviously, I covered it can use larger motherboards. Generally, most mid-size and full-size computers can use any type of motherboard, compared to the small form factor case where it can only use a small factor or a small motherboard type, such as ITX and Micro. For a mid-size and full-size, they can use full-size ATX, they can use your Micros, they can use your ITX, they can use all the different sizes, because most of the towers you get either will come with risers or will have them pre-installed, meaning that you at any point can install any size motherboard if you choose to, which is why anytime I recommend somebody a computer, I would still recommend them a mid-size case, because more space. And if they choose that they want a small motherboard but they have a mid-size case, they still have the other parts of the computer where you can add more fans, you can add more storage. Mid-size cases are generally what a lot of people go for. Obviously, room for upgrades. There's more cooling potential, and as I said, it fits most motherboards. Cons, obviously, it's a larger motherboard. So now you have to make sure that your motherboard that you're getting is what you want. And like I said, you can fit basically any size motherboard you want. It's also going to cost you a little bit more because it's a bigger case. It takes more to machine. And also, it's bigger in general, and the bigger you make stuff, the more it's going to cost. Generally, price range for small cases, if you're going with like a basic small case and not like a fancy one like Corsair usually makes for their small form factors, the small cases generally going to range you around 100, 150. Mid-size cases will generally run you between 150 to 200. It's only about a $50 difference, but you're getting a little bit more of that, upgrade potential with a mid-size case. And then obviously it's going to be heavier because it's a bigger case. It's always going to be your pros and cons, remember. So when it comes to choosing your case, always remember how big you want your computer and what you're going to use it for. There's not a lot to a mid-size computer. It's generally what you're going to see. Even with pre-built computers, they're usually using a mid-size form factor case, meaning that they're probably about as tall as your forearm to the tip of your finger. So basically from your elbow to the tip of your finger, you put it completely vertical, you could basically judge how tall it's going to be. Unless you got short arms. I don't know how to help you. I don't have, like I said, I don't have my exact measurements. I'd have to, I'll measure my case right now for you, just so you guys can get an understanding about how tall a mid-size computer is. So my computer it's about 17 and a half inches tall. So 17 and a half inches compared to a mid-size case where it's probably going to fall somewhere around 11 inches tall because it's a smaller case. So you're getting a taller case but still keeping around the same length to its height. The width of my computer, we'll grab my fancy dancy measuring tape again. The width of my computer is about 8.5, so it's about 17.5 by 8.5. It's a pretty big rectangle, but it gives you a lot of room to work with whenever you're wanting to build your computer. Last thing we'll cover is full-size cases. Full-size cases, generally, they're even bigger than my case. They're going to be bigger both in width, length, and height because they're meant to be pretty beefy. Full-size cases are one of those things that not a lot of people buy unless you're like trying to be, you have a really big budget and you have a lot of money to spend. They have a lot of room. Generally, most large form factor cases have two different areas to put fans on the front, both the very front and then the side of the computer. And then obviously you have your back fan. You have a ton of room across the top. You're generally going to have your standard ATX power supply, just like the mid-size. That's another thing I didn't cover is small size cases generally have a smaller power supply because they don't always fit a full-size power supply. But for the mid and full size, they usually are going to fit an ATX size power supply. Obviously your full size case, it's a lot of them that are pretty high end, they're going to run you between probably close between $200 to $300 just because they're a lot bigger and there's a lot of room. I've seen some full-size cases that have like 4 SSD mounting brackets and like 4 hard drive brackets all in the back of the case. There's potential for a lot of stuff to fit in a full-size case. And like I said, with the cooling, there's a ton of potential for cooling. If same thing as the mid-size motherboard, it'll fit almost any motherboard you want to put in it. And then your cons is your cost between $200 to $300 for a full-size case, and it's going to be a lot heavier, especially once you start getting all those components in there. You're talking probably between 20-30 pounds just in a full-size case. Mid-size case, I'd say probably maybe around 15-20 pounds, and then your small-size cases, depending on what you have in it, obviously, probably closer to like 10-15. They can be pretty heavy, especially for a full-size computer. I mean, those things are huge. They take up a lot of room, but also you got a ton of potential to do stuff with it. Anytime I build computers, like I said, I personally recommend a mid-size tower because it still gives you your bang for your buck between $150 $200. You got room for any size motherboard, all your fans, your power supply, your storage. My computer personally, I have 2 SSD mounting slots. I have 2 hard drive mounting slots, and then I have a full-size motherboard in my computer. So I have 2 PCIe slots and I have 2 SSD slots on the motherboard. My computer is currently set up for about 13 terabytes of storage. Because I currently have 2 4 terabyte hard drives and a 4 terabyte SSD, and I also have a single 1 terabyte SSD. And I'll explain the reason for that in a later video. Most likely when I get to the OS part of these videos, I'll explain why I have a separate single 1 terabyte hard drive or a 1 terabyte SSD. But mid-size cases, very good for, good gaming builds, or if you want to use it as an office computer, you can always do that. Any type of case or computer is completely up to whoever builds it. So if you want to have a full-size case that you're just using for office work, go for it. But I will tell you, you'd be saving yourself a lot of money if you were doing an office build by doing a small size case, and also because you can put that money you're saving into other components to make that office computer good. And vice versa, if you're building a gaming computer, like you want a really high-end gaming computer and you have a big budget, you could always go for a full-size computer. You could always have like tons of storage and maxed out RAM and the best stuff you could ever want. It's all about budgeting and what you're going to be using your computer for. So whatever you decide to do for your case, always remember cost and use. It's my 2 biggest things I like to harp on with computers. What are you going to use the computer for, and what's your budget? And if you ever have questions about computers for like your use in your budget, you can always email me, and you can always ask what a recommendation would be. Like I said, if you're telling me you're going to build an office computer, I just want to know like simple stuff like, do you plan on having a dedicated GPU? Because me personally, if I'm building an office computer, it's not going to have a dedicated GPU. I'm getting a small size case. But obviously, I don't do a ton of office work when I'm at home. Usually that stays at the office. So I have a mid-size case for my graphics card and my motherboard and all that space. But in the next video, we're most likely going to be covering motherboards. I'm going to explain the difference in the sizes of motherboards. It probably won't be pros and cons, but I'll probably just give you facts about those motherboards so you can get an understanding of the different sizes of motherboards and what they typically have for capacity on those motherboards, because different motherboards have a different amount of not only size, but what you can put into that motherboard. But that pretty much covers this video for today. If you have any other questions, then you can, like I said, leave a comment, email me, whatever you feel like you need to do. And if you have questions about, if you have further questions about cases from what I covered here, then always just send me a message or send me an email or leave a comment, and I'll do my damnedest to give you a reply, because I very much enjoy building computers, and I would never want to stop somebody else by not helping them. But I'll see all y'all guys later.